Do you know how many jelly beans are in this jar? If so, I might just let you vote. Down through the years, voters have been disenfranchised with different tactics to prevent them from taking a stand and voting. I remember my grandmother telling me stories of how hard it was to vote, whether it was a literacy test, violence, or intimidation. Today, I take a stand that voter ID should not be required in order to vote. This is just another tactic to disenfranchise voters. Did you know that in 1776 that only landowners could vote? These were normally white males over the age of 21. In 1856, North Carolina was the last state to remove the property ownership as a requirement to vote. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed, and this was citizenship is now defined and granted to former slaves, but males only. But guess what? Each state still got to regulate their own voting rights and laws, which still limited those males from voting. In 1870, the 15th Amendment passed stating the right to vote could not be deemed or denied because of race. This brought on voting taxes, literacy tests, or should I say, tests that kept the African American people from voting. There was violence and intimidation that led to the loss of African American votes. This is according to the Northern Carolina Citizenship Project Mobilization, the Immigrant Vote 2014 Capacity Building Series. Let us move forward from these tactics because they were used to suppress people over 100 years ago. Now, in 2021, they are trying to come up with new ways to suppress our voting rights. And that is with the voter ID. Many of you in this audience wouldn't think twice about voting or showing your ID when you go to the polls. Many of you are the age of 18, have a valid voter registration card, and a valid ID. I would even say that you're middle class. But I can't say that for the majority of the state of North Carolina. What about the homeless who have nowhere to live and no address or funds to purchase a valid ID? What about the elderly that no longer drive and are on a fixed income and can't get to the DMV to purchase an ID? And what about the poverty-stricken communities that can barely meet their basic needs? What about the felons who have paid their debt to society but still cannot vote? Does that mean their vote doesn't count? A significant concern, according to the League of Women Voters of Wake County, is voter ID would waste taxpayers' money and would not identify ineligible voters. Better technology, communication, and education would better identify ineligible voters prior to elections. Studies have shown that more than 200,000 registered voters in North Carolina did not have a form of ID that was acceptable for voting. Only 2 cases of voter impersonation have been detected. 2 relatives voted in the name of a deceased person. Only 1 vote was cast in person. The North Carolina State Board of Elections reports maintains that it rarely encounters and verified cases and voter of impersonation. NCSBE audit, page 67. A major issue or concern is the felony ballots. Suspected felons, can they vote while they're on parole? 129 were ineligible to vote. The NCSBE has implemented a process to reduce this number. The voter ID would have not prevented ineligible felons from voting. Non-citizens voting. The NSBE found that 97.6% of voters suspected to be non-citizens based on the DMV database were later confirmed to be U.S. citizens by the Homeland Security Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlement Programs, which is called SAVE. Voter ID would not have prevented illegal aliens from voting. Double voting. Many suspected cases of double voting proved to be administration errors by poll workers. Voter ID would not have caught these administration errors. As a result of spending time with Gerald Givens, the president of the Raleigh Apex chapter of the NAACP, I became more aware of how voter ID will disenfranchise African Americans and low-income people of color. Mr. Givens stated the Raleigh Apex NAACP is deeply aware how the right to vote impacts our lives. Elected officials oversee the criminal justice system, schools, and economic opportunities within our communities and across the state. He further stated that if an African American community and people of color do not vote, other people will make decisions that affect our lives without our input. Getting out the vote is a core value of our organization. Also, elderly voters may not have transportation to the DMV to secure the ID, and low-income residents may not have funds to pay for the IDs. It is my belief that if any eligible voter can't vote, then none of us are truly free until they can. In conclusion, after 50 years of marches and voter right laws, voting rights still matter. Whether it be a poll tax, literacy test, or a photo ID, the purpose of imposing needless burdens is not to protect the vote, but to prevent it. Thousands of people, most of whom are poor, elderly, disabled, and minority residents, would be vulnerable to losing their right to vote. And the voter ID would do nothing to protect the integrity of our elections. As stated in my thesis, requiring voter ID is a tactic that would disenfranchise many voters. Voter ID requirements is just a tactic that would prevent or take away the voter's right to vote, and that is people of color and in low-income neighborhoods. As I stated before, ID would waste taxpayers' money, voter ID would disenfranchise many voters, and voter ID would not identify all ineligible voters. I implore each of one of you to write to your local legislator to let them know how the voter ID would cause us to lose many valuable votes in North Carolina. And I continue to say, voting rights matter.